Hey guys, so for this video we're going to talk about Afib or atrial fibrillation. One, how to recognize it on the 12 lead, and two, we're going to kind of just talk about the dangers and the risks associated of it. And it can also be one of those things that if you're not familiar with, could get you really concerned, right? If you walk up to someone and grab their pulse and all of a sudden it's bouncing all over the map and you get focused in on that, but it turns out that they're in Afib all the time, which is something we're going to talk about, and not a big deal, right? So today's lesson, atrial fibrillation. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the different kinds of pulses you're going to feel. So if you think back to class, right, when we were really hard on this, when you walked up to your patient and you introduced yourself, you're like, hey, my name's Colin with the fire department, what's going on today? I should be shaking their hand, or if you don't shake their hand, which I really don't do in real life, right? I really don't reach out and shake people's hands. What I'll usually do is I'll take my left hand and I'll go find their wrist and I'll grab their pulse. Super, super important, right? Because you're learning something right away. One, it tells me something about their blood pressure, right? So if they have a radial pulse, I know that their blood pressure is above 90. So really, really important, right? So I'm getting some knowledge about their blood pressure from doing that. And then two, I'm getting a rough idea of pulse rate, right? So I'm not going to grab it and go, oh, cool, your pulse rate is 87.5. Like that's not what we're doing. What I'm trying to do is it slow, normal, or fast? And after you do it 100 times, right, like you have an idea already of like what a normal pulse should feel like. And so when you grab it, you'll know right away. And with someone with atrial fibrillation, their rhythm is what we call irregularly irregular. So I want to kind of focus on that because I feel like we don't in EMT school really talk about this enough. So your normal pulse rate is like this, right? It's just marching out. This is regular. The spaces between all your beats are the same. And if you grabbed your pulse right now and you realize it's like a clock, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's your regular pulse. Okay. Then there is two forms of an irregular pulse, and this is where it gets kind of confusing. And again, I don't think we do a good enough job in EMT school talking about this. So there's two kinds of irregular pulse. So the first one is called regularly irregular, which means it doesn't follow that 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern. It has an irregular pattern, but it repeats. So it would be like this. It would be like 1, 2, 3, gap, 1, 2, 3, gap. So it would be weird, right? Like you'd feel that and you go, that's different, but it's a pattern it repeats. Irregularly irregular would look something like this, right? It's just totally like it makes no sense. There's no pattern to it. It's all over the map. And that is what atrial fibrillation is. So when you go to that person, you introduce yourself, and hey, my name's Colin with the fire department. What's going on today? And I grab their pulse, and I realize that the pulse is like a normal rate, and then it's really fast, and then slow, and we're all over the map. And there's no pattern to it. It's irregularly irregular. And then one of the first questions I need to ask then, because I want to know if this is a normal finding or abnormal, is has the doctor ever said the words AFib or atrial fibrillation to you? And generally, if these patients have that, they're going to know, and they're going to take medications for it, and we'll talk about it. So if you ask them, hey, does the doctor ever say AFib or atrial fibrillation to you? And they say yes, well, then all of a sudden, irregularly irregular pulse isn't a really big deal, right? I can kind of move on to my next thing. And if they say no, I've never heard that word before, then you want to follow up because not everyone knows the names of their conditions, right? So then you say, well, has the doctor ever said you have a funny heartbeat? And they say, no, my heart's totally fine. Okay, well then that's a new finding today, right? And that's super important. So the very first step of understanding atrial fibrillation is to figure out with your patient, is this normal or abnormal? No different than if we go and we get a blood pressure that's 200 over 120. Well, is your blood pressure normally high? Oh yeah, it's always super high. Well, okay, then you're less concerned about it, right? Whereas if the person's like, no, I'm always 120 over 80, why is it high today? And you're like, yeah, a little bit. So good, that's our regularly irregular, irregularly irregular, and our regular patterns of our heartbeats. And like we just said, atrial fibrillation is the most common irregular rhythm. So going back to week 1, we're going to draw our heart again, right? So there's our heart. We got our 4 chambers. We have our SA node in the top, our AV node in the middle, and then our wiring system, our right and our left bundle branches, and then our Purkinje fibers down here, right? And what's going on in atrial fibrillation is that the SA node is normally the guy saying beat, right? And the whole heart follows its direction. And the problem with atrial fibrillation, and we should know this from class, because we talked about any part of the heart can generate an electrical impulse, right? So if for some reason the SA node died on us, there's other parts of the heart that can beat as like a backup system. Well, in atrial fibrillation, that backup system's kind of gone awry for a million reasons. So one of the most common questions is like, well, why are they in AFib? Well, I mean, take your pick, right? There's a ton of reasons why they could be in it, and truthfully, it's not really important for us as like emergency medicine providers to know why. That's the doctor's, the cardiologist's job. For us, we need to recognize that they're in it. So not only is the SA node beating like it should, but all these other little points that I'm going to draw here randomly in the heart, they're all saying beat as well. And the heart can't distinguish between whether, the SA node here is saying it or whether this piece over here is saying it. It doesn't know. And so, the heart listens every time someone yells beat. So in atrial fibrillation, all across the atria, different parts are saying beat. This is where our AV node gets to be really important, right? So if you remember when we were talking about the job of the AV node right here is to create that dead space that I just drew here, our PR interval. Its job is to create the dead space to allow the ventricles to fill with blood. Now, if the AV node doesn't work at all, then our ventricles are going to be going crazy, right? So the AV node, what it does is it's receiving all of these signals, all the little red signals and the SA node signal. It's receiving all of them. And it doesn't let all of them through, but it'll let some through. And it lets them through at just random times, which means the ventricles beat at random times, which means when you're feeling that patient's pulse and it's irregular, you're feeling the random beats that the AV node is choosing to let through, which makes it irregularly irregular. So what do we do about this, right? Well, before we get to that about the fix of it, let's talk about let's actually draw it out and what's it going to look like on the paper, right? So I'm going to get rid of our heart here as best I can. See if I can just cheat. Good, that was easy. All right. So again, our normal heartbeat looks like this, right? Our P, our QRS, and our T, everything's working fine. And that pattern would just repeat on and on and on. Now with atrial fibrillation, and again, remember the EKG is all just electrical signals. So that's what we're seeing on the paper. So what you're going to see with AFib is there's never a period where there's no electrical activity, right? So in a normal beating heart, the SA node says beat, and the atria all contract at the same time, and so you get one nice P wave, you get one bump. But with atrial fibrillation, constantly, at all times, the atria is quivering. It's saying beat, 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 beat. And so what you end up getting instead of this really nice single bump is you just get this nonsensical kind of scribble. And it literally looks like this, right? It's like noise the whole time because that's what's happening, right? This is just, this is beat, beat, and all of these places. The heart is the atria is just saying beat constantly. So you get this little scribble. And the AV node, like we just said, is allowing some through and not allowing others through. And so what you'll get is you'll get QRS complexes, ventricular beats, but they are not evenly spaced. You'll see that they're irregularly irregular. It's all over the map. And so your ventricular beats look like great triangles, right? Like these, I mean, forgive my drawing here, right? But these should all look the same. But you notice we don't see like really any T waves, and we certainly don't see any P waves. It's all just scribbly noise and nonsense. So if I were to feel that patient's pulse, it's irregularly irregular. And they're like, I don't know if I have AFib. I have no idea. I don't really keep track of that kind of thing. And then you take a 12 lead and you print it out. And what I see are really nice triangles that all look the same, but they're spaced out unevenly, irregularly, right? And what's in between them is just noise and nonsense. Then safe to say that they're in AFib. People in AFib are really susceptible to one thing that we need to have a really big index of suspicion for, and that is stroke. We don't have to get into why that's the case, but just know that if a patient is in AFib, that you need to have a really acute sense to things that would be reminiscent of them having a stroke. So doing like a BFAST test is going to be really important on these patients. On its own, some people are in AFib all the time, 24 hours a day, no big deal. Some people drop in and out of AFib, and for some people it doesn't matter, and for some people they get really, really sick right away. So this is where good history taking is going to be important, and like we've talked about a ton of times, it's a story and a set of vitals, and you put those two together and make your plan about what you're going to do. If you're not sure, if someone's like, I'm not sure if I have an irregular heartbeat or not, well then call for medics. Let us come and do a little investigation, and we'll do a 12 lead and we'll see this, and you can go from there. But on its own, atrial fibrillation, if it's normal, is not a big deal. They're still susceptible to strokes, and people who are not in AFib all the time, same risk factor. They could still have stroke. So this right down here is exactly what an AFib would look like. What I would say is, if you want to get a really good example of that, like go to Google, type in AFib 4-lead, and go to your images and look, and you should be able to see this. You'll see just squiggly nonsense in between irregularly spaced ventricular beats, and that would be AFib. If you have any questions, go ahead and post below, and we'll go from there. And yeah, hopefully it was helpful.